Brussels, the beating heart of the European Union, has once again become the stage of global diplomacy and moral confrontation. On this September day, the European Parliament was filled with anticipation as Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, stepped to the podium. Her speech was not just another political address. It was a declaration of intent, a reminder that Europe cannot afford silence in the face of humanitarian catastrophe and aggression. The chamber, filled with members of the European Parliament, erupted in applause as von der Leyen began. Behind her words lay months of mounting pressure, the devastation in Gaza, the endless images of displaced families, and the haunting reports of children dying from hunger and preventable diseases. Against this backdrop, von der Leyen delivered one of her most pointed and provocative messages to date. "We will propose sanctions on the extremist ministers and on violent settlers," she announced firmly, her words cutting through the silence. "And we will also propose a partial suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement on trade-related matters." The association agreement has long been the cornerstone of Europe's trade with Israel, linking billions of euros in commerce, investment and cooperation. To suspend it, even partially, is to challenge the very fabric of EU-Israel relations. For decades, Brussels has chosen cautious diplomacy. Now, von der Leyen was signalling a turning point, that Europe was prepared to wield economic power as leverage in pursuit of accountability. Her proposal struck at two levels, the symbolic and the practical. By targeting extremist Israeli ministers and violent settlers, Brussels was calling out specific political actors within Israel's government, an unprecedented step. On the economic side, suspending trade ties meant Europe was willing to absorb potential backlash for the sake of principle. For many observers, this was the clearest evidence yet that the EU was willing to confront Israel over its policies in Gaza. But von der Leyen did not stop at sanctions. Her speech took a darker, more emotional turn as she spoke about famine. With visible gravity, she said, "People killed while begging for food. Mothers holding lifeless babies. These images are simply catastrophic. So I want to start with a very clear message. Man-made famine can never be a weapon of war. For the sake of the children, for the sake of humanity, this must stop." The chamber fell silent. Her words painted a picture of Gaza not in abstract political terms, but in human reality. Starvation, she reminded her audience, is not collateral damage. It is a deliberate act when humanitarian aid is blocked, when food convoys are prevented from reaching those in need, when civilians are left to perish. Under international law, famine is prohibited as a weapon of war. By voicing this principle, von der Leyen bound Europe's credibility to action. If Brussels spoke of humanitarian law but failed to enforce it, then what did its values mean? This moral framing was deliberate. Europe has often been accused of double standards, defending human rights in speeches but compromising when interests are at stake. Today, von der Leyen attempted to bridge that gap, tying the images of starving families in Gaza to Europe's responsibility to act. Applause broke out, but beneath it lay questions. Would Europe truly follow through? Would sanctions pass among the 27 member states, some of which hold deep ties with Israel? After Gaza, von der Leyen pivoted to Ukraine, reminding the chamber that the continent was still fighting another battle, one that has tested Europe's unity since 2022. Her tone sharpened as she declared, and it should not only be European taxpayers who bear the brunt of this. This is Russia's war, and it is Russia that should pay. And this is why we need to work urgently on a new solution to finance Ukraine's war response and effort on the basis of the immobilized Russian assets. This proposal, using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's defence, is one of the most ambitious and controversial ideas currently debated in Brussels. Hundreds of billions of euros in Russian central bank reserves remain immobilised in Western jurisdictions. For months, legal scholars and policymakers have debated whether those funds could be redirected to Ukraine without violating international law. Von der Leyen's speech left no ambiguity. She wanted action, and she wanted it urgently. The logic is clear. European citizens already facing inflation, energy shocks and tight budgets are growing weary of financing Ukraine's war effort. By shifting the financial burden onto Russia, von der Leyen is not only appealing to principles of justice, she is also offering governments a political shield. If aggressors pay for their wars, taxpayers may be more willing to sustain support. Yet the risks are substantial. Russia would denounce the move as theft, and some fear it could destabilize financial markets or trigger retaliatory seizures. Von der Leyen's ability to link Gaza and Ukraine in a single speech revealed a strategic choice. To her, both crises represent an assault on human dignity and international law. In Gaza, it is famine and disproportionate violence. In Ukraine, it is invasion and territorial conquest. In both cases, she cast Europe as a defender of rules, not merely an economic bloc. But will Europe act? Within the Parliament, reactions were mixed. Applause punctuated her speech, yet many MEPs whispered doubts. Several Eastern member states, staunch allies of Israel, fear sanctions could damage vital partnerships. Southern European states worry that escalating tensions could destabilize their energy ties in the region. On Ukraine, skepticism is also real. While many support redirecting Russian assets, legal experts caution that such a move could face endless court challenges. Beyond Europe's borders, the implications are enormous. In Gaza, besieged families may take von der Leyen's words as a rare sign of recognition from a global power. In Israel, her proposals could ignite political backlash, with ministers condemning Brussels for interference. In Moscow, officials will seize on her words to paint Europe as lawless and predatory. And in Washington, policymakers will quietly assess whether Europe's moves risk straining transatlantic unity. This speech is not just policy, it is politics. Ursula von der Leyen is months away from facing European voters, and her credibility is under scrutiny. For her supporters, today's remarks show bold leadership, a willingness to speak truth to power and to anchor Europe's voice in humanitarian principles. For her critics, the proposals risk being more rhetoric than reality, a gamble that could leave Europe divided and ineffective. Still, one truth remains. Von der Leyen set down a marker. She told the world that Europe is willing to challenge allies and adversaries alike when values are at stake. She reminded her parliament that famine is not an accident but a crime, and that aggressors must pay for wars they choose to wage. She placed Europe in the centre of two of the world's most volatile crises, insisting that silence was no longer an option. As lawmakers filed out of the chamber, applause echoed in the halls. Yet outside, the real battles continued. In Gaza, where children still wait for food. In Ukraine, where soldiers brace for another winter of war. And in Europe itself, where leaders must decide whether von der Leyen's words will become policy or remain only a powerful speech. On this September day in Brussels, the European Commission President tried to redefine Europe's role, not as a hesitant bystander, but as a moral actor prepared to act, even when the costs are high. Her words now hang over capitals across the continent, challenging allies, provoking adversaries, and setting the stage for what could be some of the most consequential decisions in the EU's history.
With allies, old and new. They took Sasha and his mum to what the Russians called a we want to live in, to be open to the world and choose partnership. We will propose sanctions on the extremist ministers and on violent settlers. And we will also propose a partial suspension of the association agreement on trade-related matters. People killed while begging for food. Mothers holding lifeless babies. These images are simply catastrophic. So I want to start with a very clear message. Man-made famine can never be a weapon of war. For the sake of the children, for the sake of humanity, this must stop. needed. And it should not only be European taxpayers who bear the brunt of this. This is Russia's war, and it is Russia that should pay. And this is why we need to work urgently on a new solution to finance Ukraine's war response and effort on the basis of the immobilized Russian assets.